How can a queen, draped in jewels, endure the torment of 19 pregnancies and bury 13 of her children? Behind the glittering chandeliers of Versailles and the carefully choreographed rituals of court life, Elisabeth Charlotte's existence was marked not by power or luxury, but by a cycle of hope and despair that few could even imagine. To the outside world, she was a symbol of dynastic strength, a wife chosen to secure the future of a throne. Her gowns shimmered with silk, her jewels caught the candlelight, and her every step was measured to reflect the grandeur of a royal house. Yet beneath those layers of silk lay a body exhausted by endless childbirth, and a heart scarred by loss after loss. The same palace halls that echoed with music and diplomacy were also filled with silence after tiny coffins were carried out, one after another. 19 times she carried life within her. 19 times she bore the weight of expectation, the whispered prayers of courtiers hoping for an heir, the pressure of a dynasty demanding survival through her body. 13 times, the promise ended in death, leaving her with empty arms and a grief she was forbidden to voice too loudly. In a world where a queen's worth was measured by her children, what became of her when so many of them never lived to take a breath beyond the cradle? This is not the story of a crown sparkling in triumph, but of a woman reduced to a vessel, and of the devastating price that royalty extracted from her flesh and her soul. The tragedy of Elisabeth Charlotte is not just about numbers, not just about the pregnancies and the graves. It is about what happens when a human life is consumed by the relentless demands of a throne. Stay with us, for what you are about to hear is not only the silent suffering of a queen, but a reflection of the cruelty of power itself. And if you do not want to miss the untold truths hidden behind royal walls, make sure to watch until the end and subscribe to the Torture Throne. Elisabeth Charlotte was born into a world where her destiny was written before she could even speak. She came from the Palatinate, a region torn by political struggles and religious divisions, and from the moment of her birth, she was considered a valuable piece in the chessboard of European alliances. A princess was never just a daughter, never just a girl. She was a future bond, a treaty embodied in flesh, a vessel that would be sent across borders to secure peace or strengthen claims. When she entered the French court as the bride of Philippe I, Duke of Orléans and the brother of Louis XIV, she was not stepping into a marriage built on affection. She was stepping into a contract. The Sun King himself had chosen her, not for her beauty or charm, but because her family's Protestant ties and political standing made her a strategic asset. Her body, her future, her very life were no longer her own. They belonged to France, to the crown, and to the fragile balance of power that the Bourbon dynasty sought to preserve. The court of Versailles was a world of spectacle, where every gesture was calculated and every relationship carried political weight. Yet for Elisabeth Charlotte, the most important expectation was brutally simple: she had to bear children. A queen, a duchess, or any consort at court was judged less by her words or wit, and more by her ability to produce heirs. The grandeur of Versailles masked a truth as old as monarchy itself: women were valued for their fertility, and failure meant humiliation, whispers, and exile into irrelevance. From her earliest days at court, Elisabeth Charlotte understood this truth with piercing clarity. She wrote letters to relatives that revealed her sharp mind and blunt honesty. Unlike many courtiers, she did not hide her feelings behind masks of politeness. She admitted that her marriage to Philippe was loveless, that she was more companion than wife, and that affection was something she had to learn to live without. Still, even in this cold arrangement, her responsibility remained unshaken. She had to provide children for the House of Orléans, children who could secure the bloodline and prove her worth. In Versailles, the pressure was relentless. Every glance of a courtier, every note from a physician, every calculated smile from Louis XIV reminded her that her womb was the battlefield upon which dynastic hopes were built. Failure was not an option. Success was not celebrated as personal triumph, but as duty fulfilled. She was praised not for who she was, but for what she could deliver. The more children she bore, the more secure her place in the intricate tapestry of royal politics. To imagine her youth in this gilded cage is to see a girl who carried the weight of a nation on her shoulders. She may have laughed at times, walked in the manicured gardens of Versailles, or admired the glittering fountains that were designed to show the power of France. But beneath it all lingered the unshakable awareness that her value was tied to her ability to conceive. The joy of simply being young, of having choices, was never hers. The irony was cruel. Elisabeth Charlotte was known for her sharp tongue, her wit, and her refusal to conform to the artificial airs of courtly life. She preferred honesty to flattery, substance to glitter. Yet the very court that found her manners blunt and her looks plain still demanded her most intimate labor. She could resist in words, she could reject the empty compliments of courtiers, but she could not escape the expectation that she would bear children until her body could no longer endure. And so her youth, which might have been a season of freedom and self-discovery, became instead a prelude to exhaustion. The royal family, the courtiers, and the crown itself looked to her not with affection, but with calculation. Each year that passed was measured not by her growth as a woman, but by the number of children she could bring into the world. It was this unyielding expectation that set the stage for the torment to come. For what began as duty soon became a cycle of endless pregnancies, each one laden with hope and shadowed by fear, a cycle that would define the rest of her life. The first time Elisabeth Charlotte felt the stirrings of life within her, it was not only her heart that lifted. The court, ever watchful, greeted the news with the satisfaction of a gambler holding a promising hand. Physicians hovered, courtiers whispered, and the Queen of France herself sent polite inquiries. For a moment, Elisabeth Charlotte's position seemed secure. She was fulfilling the role demanded of her. And even if her marriage was one of political necessity rather than love, her pregnancy gave her purpose. There was joy, of course, a quiet kind that she rarely allowed others to see. She confided her hopes in letters to her family back in Germany, words laced with both humor and relief. For a young woman who had been thrown into the elaborate theater of Versailles, this was one thing that felt entirely her own. She dreamed, as all mothers do, of hearing a child's laughter echo through the palace halls, of holding a future in her arms. But the dream quickly turned against her. The first infant she carried did not survive long. Death came softly, swiftly, almost as if the child had been borrowed for only a breath of life before being taken back. In the cold language of the court, it was a misfortune, nothing more. Courtiers bowed, whispered condolences, and moved on. The palace did not stop for the death of a baby. No bells tolled, no mourning clothes were worn. It was simply one more casualty in the endless struggle of dynasties to reproduce themselves. Elisabeth Charlotte grieved in silence. In Versailles, grief was private, almost shameful. A queen or duchess was expected to recover quickly, to prepare her body once more for the next attempt. To show too much sorrow was to risk being seen as weak. And so she did what women of her station had done for centuries. She swallowed her tears, lifted her head, and returned to duty. The second pregnancy brought renewed hope. This time, courtiers whispered that perhaps fortune had turned. The fountains of Versailles sparkled as if in celebration. And once again, the physicians prepared for a birth that could secure her standing. She endured the long months with determination, her body aching, yet her spirit clinging to the idea that this child might live. When the infant arrived, alive and breathing, she felt the kind of relief that words cannot capture. For a fleeting moment, she believed she had conquered fate. But within weeks, the child's cries grew weaker. Fevers swept through the nursery. The remedies of court physicians, leeches and tonics and prayers, could do little. And then silence. The cradle stood still, and another tiny coffin left the palace under cover of formality. This was how the pattern began. With each pregnancy, hope bloomed only to be crushed by the reality of fragile infant lives in a time when medicine offered little protection. What was joy to a mother became routine to the court. Officials marked the births in ledgers, noted the deaths with equal detachment, and moved forward as if nothing had happened. For Elisabeth Charlotte, it was a slow erosion of the soul. For the courtiers, it was business as usual. What made it unbearable was the indifference. A royal child dead was not unusual, they said. In fact, it was expected. High infant mortality was woven into the fabric of 17th century life. Yet for her, these were not statistics. They were children, each one carrying a name, a possibility, a fragment of her heart. To the courtiers, they were symbols, potential heirs whose deaths were inconvenient, but not devastating. To her, they were flesh and blood, carried beneath her ribs, lost too soon to silence. Still, she endured. Each loss left her weaker, but each new pregnancy brought the command to hope again. She was told to be strong, to remember her duty, to focus not on the graves that multiplied, but on the future children who might live. The pressure of the dynasty never relented, and the cycle of expectation and heartbreak became the rhythm of her life. It was in these early pregnancies that the pattern of her existence crystallized: moments of joy, swiftly followed by grief, and all of it overshadowed by a court that regarded her suffering as ordinary. This was not yet the nightmare in full, but it was the beginning, and it would only grow darker as the years unfolded. As the years passed, Elisabeth Charlotte's body became the silent battlefield of dynastic ambition. Each pregnancy etched deeper lines into her face, drained the color from her cheeks, and left her more fragile than before. What began with youthful strength and hope slowly turned into a cycle of exhaustion. Her health deteriorated with every new child she carried. Physicians noted her weakening pulse, her bouts of fever, her difficulty in recovering. Yet still the expectation was the same: she must endure. To the court, her body was an instrument, a vessel to be used until it broke. To her, it was a prison. The palaces that glittered with gold were also cages, and within them she was trapped in an endless repetition of labor and loss. Her frame grew thinner, her posture less upright, her eyes dulled by sleepless nights and unspoken grief. Versailles remained radiant, but she withered inside its walls. Each time she conceived, Conflicting emotions took hold of her. There was hope. Yes, the fragile flicker that perhaps this time the child would live. But there was also fear, sharp and inescapable. The memory of coffins, of empty cradles, returned to her like ghosts. She knew too well that joy could be stolen in an instant. For every life that quickened inside her, death seemed already waiting at the door. The physical toll was merciless. Childbirth in the 17th century was perilous for any woman, even a duchess surrounded by physicians. Infections spread easily. Complications during labor were common, and the remedies offered were often as harmful as the ailments they sought to cure. Elisabeth Charlotte endured hemorrhages, fevers, and the relentless fatigue that never fully lifted before the next pregnancy began. Her body never had time to heal. Yet she had no choice. The rhythm of her life was dictated not by her own desires, but by the demands of the dynasty. To refuse was unthinkable. Her value was measured in children, and so long as her womb could still carry life, she was expected to submit to the cycle again and again. The court saw not a woman breaking, but a duty being fulfilled. Her letters reveal her honesty in ways the court would not have tolerated had she spoken aloud. She wrote of her ailments with a kind of blunt clarity, noting her weakness, her exhaustion, and even her disgust with the empty flattery of those around her. But she also revealed the resilience that carried her forward. She did not collapse entirely into despair. She faced each new pregnancy with a grim determination, the stubborn hope that perhaps one child would outlast the shadow of death. That duality defined her life, the constant oscillation between fragile optimism and crushing dread. She could cradle an infant and feel joy bloom in her chest, only to watch illness take it away before the bond had even settled. She could walk through the gardens of Versailles, her hand resting protectively on her abdomen, while silently fearing she was nurturing yet another child destined for the grave. It was a nightmare that did not relent. The court, so obsessed with appearances, never stopped its dances or spectacles for her grief. Life at Versailles went on with music and laughter. Even as her body bent beneath invisible weights, she was expected to smile, to attend ceremonies, to play her role with dignity, while inside she knew she was fading. What is most haunting is that she was not unique. She was emblematic of countless royal women whose bodies bore the burden of dynasties. Yet her story is particularly stark. A portrait of a woman who endured 19 pregnancies, who watched 13 of her children vanish, and who carried the scars of that ordeal until her final days. The nightmare repeated itself until her body could no longer resist. Hope, fear, birth, and death became a grim cycle that defined her existence. And as the years went on, the toll was not only physical, it eroded her spirit, leaving her caught between a duty she could not escape and a grief she could not fully express. The death of a royal child in Versailles was never allowed to disturb the machinery of power. When Elisabeth Charlotte's infants died, the court responded with swift, muted ceremony. Tiny coffins were prepared, often covered in velvet or silk, as though rich fabrics could soften the tragedy. Priests whispered prayers, courtiers bowed their heads for a moment, and then the palace returned to its rhythm of music, banquets, and political intrigue. For her, it was not a ceremony. It was agony repeated 13 times. She stood in rooms lit by candles, watching processions of servants carry away what remained of her hopes. These funerals were short, often perfunctory, designed not to honor the lives lost, but to maintain appearances. A monarchy could not afford to be seen as fragile, so the deaths of children were folded into protocol, treated as if they were expected. Elisabeth Charlotte mourned in silence. The rules of the court did not allow a mother to collapse in grief. To cry too openly was considered unbecoming of a duchess, a weakness that disrupted the image of strength. So she swallowed her pain while courtiers whispered of the next pregnancy, as though the one who had just died had never existed. The contrast was unbearable. Versailles glowed with chandeliers. Its fountains danced in the gardens. Music filled the air. Yet she walked through corridors that for her echoed with absence. In her heart she carried the memory of each child, the sound of cries that had lasted only days or weeks, the weight of bodies that never had the chance to grow strong. These memories haunted her far more than the ceremonies intended to erase them. Letters she wrote reveal how little comfort she found in ritual. She admitted that no prayers, no processions, no velvet-draped coffin could mend the wound of burying a child. To her, the grandeur only deepened the cruelty. The splendor that surrounded the burials seemed to mock the simplicity of her loss. For what she wanted was not ceremony, but life. By the time the 13th coffin was carried away, the repetition had carved itself into her being. Each burial was different in detail, but identical in effect. Hope was extinguished, love was severed, and she was left to face a court that moved on without her grief. To the dynasty, children were instruments of succession. To her, they were flesh of her flesh, and the graves multiplied until her heart bore more weight than her body ever could. The tragedy of Elisabeth Charlotte is not in the numbers alone, but in the way those numbers were treated. 13 times she endured the loss. 13 times she was told to continue, and 13 times the court brushed aside her mourning as though it were nothing more than another formality. In the silence of her chambers, however, it was everything. By the closing years of her life, Elisabeth Charlotte was no longer the resilient young woman who had arrived at Versailles with blunt honesty and sharp wit. Decades of pregnancies, grief, and the unrelenting demands of the court had left her body frail. Her health deteriorated rapidly. She suffered repeated strokes, each one stealing a little more of her strength, twisting her limbs, and dimming her once commanding presence. The courtiers who had once measured her worth in children now saw only a woman marked by illness, a figure fading into the shadows of the palace. The grandeur of Versailles offered her no comfort. Its glittering mirrors reflected a body she barely recognized. Her face, once animated with laughter and sharp remarks, grew slack with age and pain. Her gait slowed, her breath shortened, and the rituals of court life became burdens too heavy to bear. Yet even in this weakened state, she was not afforded rest. The palace continued its endless dances, its feasts, its displays of power. While she drifted further from the center, her presence tolerated but no longer needed. Loneliness became her constant companion. The children who had survived into adulthood were drawn into their own obligations, their own struggles within the intricate politics of France. Distance grew not only in geography, but in affection. They had their roles to play, their alliances to guard, their reputations to maintain. For their mother, this meant long hours in chambers that echoed with silence. She had given her life to secure their existence. Yet in her final years, she found herself alone. What was most cruel was the way the court remembered her, not as a woman of wit, not as a duchess who endured, but as a womb that had served its purpose. In their eyes, her body had been a vessel of continuity. Once its power was spent, she became almost invisible. This reduction of her identity, this stripping away of everything but her role as a mother, deepened her isolation more than any physical ailment could. Still, she retained flashes of the blunt voice that had always set her apart. In her letters, she continued to mock the vanity of courtiers, the excesses of Versailles, the hypocrisy that surrounded her. Even as her body failed, her words preserved something of her spirit. She did not soften into sentimentality. Instead, she carried her honesty to the end, refusing to flatter those who had confined her life to duty. Yet honesty could not shield her from the pain of decline. The strokes left her partially paralyzed. Eating became difficult, walking exhausting. Servants attended her, but they did so out of obligation, not affection. The court did not rally to her side. The spectacle of Versailles was built to hide decay, not to honor it. A dying duchess did not fit into the choreography of power. In these years, she embodied the cruel paradox of royalty. She had been surrounded all her life by people, yet she was profoundly alone. She had been wrapped in luxury, yet denied the simplest joys of freedom, companionship, and peace. She had lived within walls designed to project glory, yet those same walls closed in on her with suffocating emptiness. The image of her final years is one of contradiction. A woman once feared for her sharp tongue, now silenced by illness. A mother who had carried 19 lives left with only memories of loss. A duchess who had been central to the machinery of succession reduced to a relic, tolerated but not cherished. Her suffering did not end in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow decline, marked by failing health and the steady erosion of presence. This was not the theatrical tragedy of a queen executed or a king dethroned. It was the quiet tragedy of a woman consumed by the very system she had upheld. And yet, in her decline, a truth became unmistakable. Her story was not only about her own pain, it was a mirror of the cruelty inflicted on countless women whose value was measured in children, whose worth was reduced to biology, whose humanity was overlooked by dynasties intent only on survival. History often remembers kings for their wars, their conquests, their legacies carved in marble and ink. Queens, however, are too often remembered for their wombs. Elisabeth Charlotte's life is not told in victories or decrees, but in the staggering number of children she bore, and the countless more she buried. Her name lingers as a footnote in dynastic charts. Yet behind those sterile records was a woman whose body and soul were consumed by the weight of the crown. Her story forces us to confront the true cost of monarchy. For all the gilded ceilings and glittering ceremonies, the crown demanded blood. Not only on battlefields where soldiers fell, but in the private chambers where women labored, wept, and died unseen. The throne was not merely a seat of power. It was a pit, devouring flesh and bone, swallowing lives in silence, and leaving behind only the illusion of permanence. Elisabeth Charlotte was neither the first nor the last to suffer this fate. Across Europe, royal women were reduced to instruments, their identities erased beneath titles, their worth calculated in children. Yet her life remains one of the starkest portraits of this cruelty. 19 pregnancies, 13 deaths, a body broken, a spirit silenced, a woman remembered not for who she was, but for what she endured. And what she endured tells us something larger. It reveals the machinery of power, the way dynasties fed upon the very people meant to sustain them. Versailles may have glittered like a temple to beauty, but at its heart lay a truth far darker. Behind the chandeliers and fountains, The palace was a mausoleum for dreams that never lived, for women whose humanity was devoured by duty. When we walk through history, we often see only the grandeur. We see portraits painted in oil, crowns displayed in glass cases, names inscribed on monuments. But if we look closer, we also see the shadows. The coffins carried quietly through palace corridors. The faces of mothers who smiled in public while breaking in private. The silence of halls that once held the cries of children, silenced too soon. This is the legacy of Elisabeth Charlotte. Not triumph, but testimony. Her life bears witness to the invisible cost of monarchy. A reminder that power does not only consume those who wield swords, but also those whose bodies were made to bear heirs. She is remembered today not because she ruled, but because she survived. And in her survival, we see the scars of a system that treated women as vessels and nothing more. Her tragedy echoes even now. It invites us to ask questions that cut deeper than the pageantry of history. If queens endured such torment for the sake of crowns, what did it mean for ordinary women, far from palaces, who had no silk to soften their pain, no ceremony to disguise their losses? If this was the fate of a duchess at the heart of one of Europe's most powerful courts, how much more brutal was life for those without wealth, without servants, without the protection of status? The throne remains an enduring symbol of authority, but Elisabeth Charlotte's life reveals it also as a grave, demanding endless sacrifice and offering little in return. Her story is not simply a relic of the past. It is a mirror held to power itself, a reminder that beneath crowns and empires lie bones, blood, and silence. And so her name deserves to be spoken not only as a Duchess of Orléans, not only as the wife chosen for dynastic convenience, but as a woman whose suffering forces us to question what history chooses to honor. Her life asks us to see beyond the gilding, to recognize the humanity that was buried beneath ritual, and to acknowledge the price that women paid so that thrones could endure. If queens suffered this much for the crown, what did it mean for ordinary women? That is the question her story leaves us with, a question that lingers beyond the marble of Versailles and into our own reflections on power and sacrifice. If you found this story worth remembering, do not let it vanish into silence. Like, share, and subscribe to The Torture Throne, where the hidden truths of history are brought back to light, and the voices once silenced are finally heard.